Hello, welcome to the Raw podcast brought to you by the Sunderland Echo. My name is Jason Jones. I'm joined by James Copley. No Phil Smith this week. He's having a well-earned day off after a trip to Oxford on Sunday afternoon. We will get onto that game. We will talk about Sunderland advancing to the fifth round of the FA Cup. But there's only really one place to start, James, and that's obviously the news on Friday. The Kristjaan Speakman, sporting director, has left Sunderland after a really successful few years, I think it's fair to say, at the club. I mean, what are your thoughts on this? Because it kind of felt as if it came a little bit out of the blue, didn't it?
Yeah, I think it's really, really, really interesting. I think it probably illuminates that Kirill Dreyfus does not shy away from making big decisions. And I think we've seen that over a long period of time. Just looking back to the summer, the club's general transfer strategy, no room for sentiment, no room for loyalty. We've seen it before this current crop of players. So before the likes of Dan Neil, Patrick Roberts, Anthony Patterson, we saw it with Lyndon Gooch, we saw it with Danny Bath, we saw it to a degree with Tony Mowbray. So I think the timing was perhaps a little bit of a surprise in the sense that it came out of the blue, but I think probably the writing's been on the wall since Florent Ghisolfi was appointed back in the summer. We know he led the £150 million rebuild in the summer, but I think in terms of Kristjaan Speakman, he deserves a great deal of credit for essentially handing over the club to Florent Ghisolfi in a dignified manner over two windows. I think he's made Florent Ghisolfi's life a lot easier. I think he's done a great service to the club. And I think in terms of that position at Sunderland, where the only real competitors are Lee Congerton and Roberto De Fanti, he goes down as Sunderland's best ever for that role of sporting director. And I believe one of the most significant figures in the club's modern day history. Of course, success at a football club is always collective, and we should point towards the likes of Stuart Harvey as well, who's also gone. That directorship and that leadership has served Sunderland very well. Policy is always implemented from above, and Kirill Dreyfus has the vision for the club. He funds the club, so he deserves credit as well. Then there's lots of scouts, managers that deserve credit. The players deserve a huge amount of credit, even the fans. So I think success and failure is always collective, definitely. But would Sunderland be where they are now without Kristjaan Speakman? I don't personally believe so. I think he's done a brilliant job, and he leaves with our thanks. You know, progress at a football club isn't always linear, and we should point out that there have been bumps along the road. He was heavily questioned when he appointed Michael Beale, of course, and there have been different little bits and things that have happened that he's got flack for. You know, we didn't have a striker for 18 months. The failure to sort of build on that Tony Mowbray playoff side. So it hasn't always been linear, but I think the end destination, you have to say that Kristjaan Speakman has been a net positive for Sunderland. What I think is really interesting is what this says about where Sunderland, under Kirill Dreyfus, want to go now, which is, yeah, as I say, interesting and exciting, but it also carries a little bit of risk with it as well, because you're essentially changing things and moving into what I see as phase 2 of the plan, because 2 days today from recording on the 18th of February is when Kirill Dreyfus enacted this 5-year plan. That's now reached its conclusion with Sunderland back in the Premier League. So it sort of speaks to this notion of a sort of refreshment, a reboot, and Sunderland sort of exploring and navigating their way as a different type of football club now. And I'm really interested to see how this goes.
Yeah, it's sort of crazy, isn't it, that 5-year plan thing. So I remember when it was initially said, it felt not necessarily pie in the sky, but, you know, it was a real statement of ambition, wasn't it? And then to actually almost bring it into land almost 5 years to the day is bordering on ludicrous, really. I mean, obviously we will talk about what comes next and Florent Ghisolfi and all of those things. But as you've sort of alluded to there, I mean, it hasn't always been plain sailing. There have been some signings that haven't worked out. Obviously, you spoke about the McBeal appointment, you know, certain periods of Speakman's tenure at the club that have perhaps been more difficult than others. But I think it really is a measure, isn't it, James, when you think about where the club were, where the squad was, what the starting 11 was when he first came into the club, and now where he leaves the club. I mean, it's night and day, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and the overarching policy at the club has been outstanding, really. The lean in towards the academy, the recruitment of young domestic players that perhaps needed a lifeline, needed a little bit of a reboot, building it around this culture of the fans, developing an identity, buying low, selling high. I mean, the people have posted it all over Twitter, and I'm I'm unsure of the figures specifically, but the market value of the team he inherited, which included the likes of I think Callum McFadzean, Josh Scowen, amongst others that we can name, with all respect to those players, the team in which he leaves is a million miles away from that, 2 divisions above, with a market value of in excess of probably like 200-300 million, something like that. So he leaves a very, very good legacy. But I think, again, what I would emphasize is that, you know, it's always collective, this sort of success. And what is actually interesting to me is that 3 of the pillars of Sunderland's sort of reboot, so Stuart Harvey, Kristjaan Speakman, and Robin Nichols. Robin Nichols was the academy manager. Stuart Harvey was the head of recruitment. Kristjaan Speakman was the club sporting director. They're either going or have gone, because Robin Nichols is set to go to America at the end of the year. So it just speaks to the fluid nature, I think, of these football clubs. They're always trying to evolve. I think in the Premier League, you know, standing still is not a good idea. You do need to try and push things forward. And obviously, it must have been felt that Speakman had sort of, I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase it, but outlived is worth it in a sense. I know that sounds very, very harsh, and it probably is in a way, but again, it speaks to how decisively Kira Louis-Dreyfus thinks he has to act to push this club forward. And Florent Ghisolfi probably presents a different type of sport and directorship in terms of the contacts he has across Europe, the way he can tap into European markets. We know Sunderland are sort of going that way with the arrivals of Noah Siddiqui. So it's very interesting. I've completely forgotten what your question was, Jason, but what was it again?
I was just saying, and again, you kind of answered it, to be fair, mate, but just how far
that's good.
Has come in a roundabout sort of way, you know. But you know, but the club has come so far, hasn't it? And I think you're absolutely right to be talking about where it goes next, essentially, because, you know, the way that I sort of look at it is not necessarily a case of Speakman's worth or anything like that, but, you know, he's brought in to do a job, and he's done that job. Sunderland have gotten to where they wanted to get to under him. You know, they evidently feel that, like you say, there is a next step to be taken. If the sort of Ghisolfi era, if you like, is going to be a reflection of what we already saw in the summer, then I think that Sunderland are probably looking at it and they're going, well, you know, he's had a bloody good start. These signings have made a really good impression, and maybe they just perhaps feel that the ceiling is potentially a little bit higher with him at the helm, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and just to circle back to your initial question there before I started blabbering on, but the calls to rely on the academy, to give Dan Neil a chance, to parachute Anthony Patterson in, to really push Chris Rigg, to buy the likes of Dennis Serkin and Trey Human, play them regularly when they were 19, 20 in the EFL, which is a hard league, to loan Callum Doyle at 17 years old and play him, to completely turn the club's reputation around in terms of how it is seen from the outside world, which Sunderland have done with proof points generally with their loans and academy players and players they've brought in to do that. These aren't easy decisions. It's very hard to justify that, you know, getting Joe Bellingham in and playing him as a 17-year-old. When things aren't going well, you can cop a lot of flack for that, but I think fair play to them because they stayed true to the vision, and it's ended up working out for Sunderland. I've seen Kristjaan Speakman and Sunderland generally sort of described as a little bit lucky, and I think in football there's always an element of luck, right? But I think it was built on extremely solid foundations that have served the club well, and not only did it serve the club well through League One into the Championship, but really that splurge last summer was made possible because Sunderland was so tightly ran in the Championship, and they were able to pull the trigger on a couple of key sales. They didn't outspend when there was pressure to do so. You look at a player like Kiefer Moore, when Michael Beale really needed a striker. We were all disappointed not to get him, but that could have really impacted the club financially going forward. The deal didn't work. They copped a lot of flack for that. They wouldn't do it unless it was right for them in all manner. In all aspects, sorry. And over the long term, that proved out to be a wise decision because Sunderland probably wouldn't have got into the playoffs even with Kiefer Moore through the door at that point because it was a disaster of a season, and it then allowed them to sort of go again the next. So there's lots of things you can point towards, but my gut feeling is that with Speakman and how it's ended with Sunderland is that it's probably his foreign-based recruitment which has done it. Now, I think, again, you have to take a holistic view at this. So, like the likes of Jan Poveda, I think Simon Adingra was a big one that Speakman potentially pushed for. It hasn't been as good as the domestic signings under Speakman. I think that is fair to say. But then again, you do have to look across the board, because Timothy Pembele, Abdullah Bar, I'm led to believe that these were more Kira Louis-Dreyfus signings. Obviously, there's always a conversation across everybody at the club. Jefferson Bennett was somebody that was scouted highly by Stuart Harvey and pushed for, but then again, Stuart Harvey pushed hard for Trey Hume, and Speakman helped execute that deal. So we tend to give a lot of credit to one person, but there's a lot goes on behind the scenes. Similarly, when we are criticising other people for a Jefferson Bennett or an Abdullah Bar, that again speaks to the nature of how there are multiple people always working across these deals. And yes, ultimately is his responsibility, but I think there are a lot of chefs involved in the cooking, and I think that probably deserves and warrants a little note from us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's the same in any football club, isn't it? Not every player you sign is going to be a runaway success. But I think the key is that, again, we talk about general trajectory, the trend of where Sunderland have headed under Speakman. Obviously with the caveat that he's worked alongside a lot of people, we're sort of using his name as like a byword, but obviously with that understanding, it's been so overwhelmingly positive. And obviously there were sticky patches, but they've worked through them. And I think that ultimately, like you say, you got to look where the club was at when he came in. You got to look where the club is at now, and I think that alone is enough to suggest that he's been a huge success. And I mean, one thing I did want to ask you about as well, James, is it perhaps the case that one of the biggest successes of Speakman's tenure has been this change in perception of what Sunderland is? This idea that they will provide opportunity for young players. When using someone as Joe Bellingham as an example, someone who's come through the door, relatively low fees, been given the opportunity to grow, to express himself, and then he's gone on and sealed a move to Borussia Dortmund for big money, to the benefit of everybody involved, club, player, all of those things. And it kind of feels, to me at least, that, prior to Speakman, Sunderland were just in a whole other world in that regard, and he sort of has rehabilitated the image of the club and or at least helped to rehabilitate the image of the club alongside Louis Dreyfus, all this sort of stuff, and made it a viable option for young players again.
Yeah, I think you're right to point that out. I think the culture of the club has really come full circle under Kristjaan Speakman, and it deserves to be pointed out. If you cast your mind back to the last time we were relegated from the Championship to League One, and those Premier League days as well, we really, other than the fans being very strong, we had no idea of what this club should be. We had a little sprinkling and an inkling with the likes of Pickford and Henderson that the club's academy could be a great strength, but we had no real plan or pathway from under 18s or under 16s to the first team. We had no real identity, no real structure. We lurched from one thing to the other. And unfortunately, we had to go all the way back down to League One to be asset stripped and then rebuilt from the ground up. But I think that is one of the major achievements of Kristjaan Speakman, is that he has made Sunderland sort of palatable on the world stage again, to be brutally honest. Callum Doyle was the first big proof point. We took a player, a highly rated youngster off Manchester City. We handled him well. We played him. We kept to our agreements, but crucially, we also knew when to take him out. And Sunderland have done that, regularly with loanees in the past. Now, under Speakman, they've done it with young players. They've handled them well. Just as, the likes of Chris Rigg and Daniel Anthony Patterson, who were pushed. I think an underrated facet of Kristjaan Speakman's sport and directorship as well, which has been backed by Louis Dreyfus's finances, of course, is contract management. Sunderland are very rarely in a position now where contracts are running to an end when there shouldn't be. Maybe Dan Neil aside recently, but that wasn't in the end a major asset that we all thought he sort of would have been. So I think that definitely is worth noting. And just generally as well, I think the way he's handled himself, he has come in from criticism from some quarters. I know his use of language at times has frustrated. He did also once say that Leon Jaku was a striker, and he sort of definitely wasn't. So I do understand that little bit of frustration from supporters in some ways, but generally the way he's conducted himself has been uber professional. I know he gets criticism for maybe speaking a bit in LinkedIn parlance. To be honest, I don't really mind that. If you want to talk like that, that's absolutely fine. You are working in a professional environment at the end of the day, and I much prefer that to the sort of lager drinking Charlie Methven having a pop at Sunderland fans every 5 minutes. I thought Kristjaan Speakman was dignified, respectful. I think he's handled agents very well. I've spoken to a fair few agents who've dealt with Kristjaan Speakman who have been not very happy. But when you look into those situations, he's actually done best by the football club. People look at the Alex Pritchard situation. I do feel for Alex Pritchard in that situation, because he had played well, but he did find himself out of the team. He wanted a new contract. He wanted money that Sunderland weren't prepared to pay. It came at a time of trouble, really, at the football club, didn't it? And Kristjaan Speakman handled that not with his ego, but more with the club in mind, in my opinion, because in their mind, they were happy for Pritchard to stay, but they weren't prepared to give him the money that he wanted, because he wasn't necessarily going to be a starter, and that money would have unlocked more doors for Sunderland. A big call at the time, whether he should have come out and publicly stated that he offered Alex Pritchard a contract which he knew was going to be rejected. You know, these are the sort of dark arts of things that happen. But I think what we can say, regardless of the external noise, is that he always acted in the club's best interests. And I think that's hugely, hugely important. There's no doubt he also rubbed some people up the wrong way over dealings. But generally, I think the way he's dealt with players and agents has been overwhelmingly good. Look at the Jack Clark situation, the Ross Stewart situation, even the Joe Bellingham situation. What's gained Sunderland respect is that they will sell you when you want to be sold at the right time. If it suits everybody, they won't stand in your way. That's not to say that Sunderland are going to be a stepping stone forever, but the way he's positioned the club has been very, very beneficial in my view, because it allows us to get good players through the door on the understanding that when a bigger opportunity comes, then you can leave. But hopefully you'll leave the club in a better place and it becomes a better opportunity for somebody who's coming through to replace you, with the main goal, I guess, for Sunderland to become the destination one day. So I think he's done a fantastic job. As I say, it wasn't always linear, but nothing ever is, really, and it all worked out well in the end. It was a bit up in the air at one point. I'm not going to sort of rewrite history. There were people baying for his blood and all of that sort of stuff, but I think he leaves Sunderland with his legacy intact. That's for sure.
And I guess now, obviously, we do look to the future. Florent Ghisolfi probably going to be heading up these things going forward. I mean, how much confidence do you have in him to make a success of that?
I have a great deal of confidence at the moment, because it was under his leadership that we recruited so well in the summer. Everybody you speak to says it was Ghisolfi was leading that with help from Speakman. As I say, Speakman deserves a lot of credit for helping to hand over the club and making that transition smooth. I think he faces a number of challenges. I think, obviously, the Premier League, second season in the Premier League, it could present problems. So the trick is to get that recruitment right again. You know, Sunderland have a bit of money to spend as well. So you've got to spend that money right. Where do you spend it? Do you spend it on younger players? Do you maintain this 20 to 24 age group model that we've adopted? Do you push the boat out on more signings like Granit Xhaka and Nordi Mukwele? Do you go and start spending money upwards of 30, 40 million? We've seen Sunderland do 30. We've seen them hover around the 20 million mark. But how far do they push it? It only takes getting one of those big signings wrong. So it's a fine line. If you get one of those big signings wrong, it can really hamper you. And I think generally, you know, keeping the contract management going, I think, as well, is hugely important for Ghisolfi. But he'll be aware of all this sort of stuff. He'll know what works. And I think just generally, in a sort of philosophical sense, it's like striking the balance between ambition and sustainability. Sunderland will have to sell players to progress, but you still want the club to be ambitious. If you underinvest, you probably risk a little bit of regression, and if you overspend chasing like acceleration, you'll probably risk heavy financial strain. So with anything, it's a big tightrope that he's walking. And I think my sort of fundamental thought about Ghisolfi would be protecting and sort of strengthening Sunderland's strong identity in a way where we know what this club is now, but how does it sort of now look in the Premier League? It's been built on the academy. It's been built on giving young players a chance. And we're sort of seeing it a little bit in terms of the team at the moment. Like, where do the likes of Chris Rigg and Eliza Mayenda fit now? Where does that pathway lead? How has that pathway changed from the academy through to the first team? Because Sunderland, I think for the first time in a generation, we really know what we are. The club have these slogans, the till the end, bold, creative, industrious. And I'd like to see that strengthened and continued, because I think for the past 5 years, it's been brilliant to watch that grow, the connection between the fans, the team, the ownership. It's as aligned and as strong as I've seen in a long, long time.
I guess the other thing to say as well is that Kristjaan Speakman himself, I mean, obviously no indication what his next move is, where he goes, if he stays in football, anything like that. But I mean, he's not going to be short of offers, is he? Not after the job he's done in the Northeast.
No, definitely not. I think if I was an ambitious Championship club, I would be looking at Speakman and Harvey would be my first two phone calls. Yeah, I don't know these clubs' situations like specifically in terms of who's there at the moment, apart from John Walters at Stoke. But if I was a Stoke or a Birmingham City owner, I'd be thinking, well, these guys can really spend money economically, that can identify players that can move through the leagues. I'm not saying these clubs are horrendous at the moment, because they're obviously not, but they could definitely provide a spark. Yeah, I don't think they're going to be short of offers. And I guess this speaks to the surprising nature and the ruthlessness by Kirill Louis-Dreyfus, the need and the want to push the club forward. He's obviously decided that Speakman's not the right man to do that anymore. But I would hazard a guess is perhaps in the summer, if you ask Sunderland fans what concerned them about heading into the Premier League, was that if Sunderland continued to grow and stay up, then would Speakman potentially be poached by another top flight club or somebody else? Because good sporting directors are hard to come by, and Speakman genuinely has excelled in that role. So it's funny how things work out. But if you're a football club looking for people to come in and affect things and affect change, I think Speakman would be top of the list. It shouldn't be understated the journey he's taken Sunderland on, obviously with the caveat of help as well. But I mean, it felt like we were marooned in League One for so long. It felt like we were never going to get out of there. So to now be in the Premier League in 5 years is a very much a pinch yourself moment. And I think he could do a brilliant job elsewhere. I really believe that.
Absolutely. Should we talk about some actual football then?
Yes. Yeah.
First game of the post-Speakman era, if you like, Oxford United on Sunday afternoon. Sunderland through the fifth round of the FA Cup for the first time since, 2015? It's been more than a decade now, which is sort of crazy in and of itself, isn't it? Like I say, 1-0 win, BBDR penalty. Maybe not Sunderland's most sparkling performance, I think it's fair to say, James, but I mean, does it really matter when you're through the fifth round?
Yeah, I mean, the first half wasn't very good at all, to be honest, albeit Sunderland took the lead. I never felt as if Oxford really threatened. I know Danny Mills' son on the wing beat Circuit a couple of times, to be honest with you. So they did carve out a few opportunities. I thought Luke O'Neill was excellent, deserved man of the match winner, but I never really felt that threatened. In the second half, I thought Sunderland really improved, should have scored more, but it's good to come away from Oxford with a win into the next round. I think it was job done. It was a rotated side, not wholesale change, but a rotated side. I think there was 6 changes in the end, but the players that came in, you would expect to beat a Championship outfit. I thought Romain Mundell, it was a big step forward for him. I thought he was excellent on the day. I think my one concern would be, obviously, Sunderland aren't really free scoring no matter who you put on the pitch at the moment, and it doesn't really matter who the opposition is either. So that is a bit of a sort of short to mid-term concern, but there are lots of positives. That Jocelyn Tarby came off the bench and he looked really good. Actually, he's definitely got something. I'm always very reluctant to sing a player's praises too early or criticize him, because I think you need time, but he really sparkled actually when he came on, and he wasn't particularly on that long. So great to get into the next round. Obviously the draw's tonight at 6:30, so by the time you listen to this, you'll probably know who we're going to get, and I think it's quite exciting. Where, what is it, 3 games from Wembley, is it, Jace? 2 games from what is it?
It's 2 now, isn't it? Around
two games from Wembley. Yeah, so 1 game from the quarterfinal, 2 games from Wembley. Thank you for saving my blushes there. But yeah, it's nice to have a cup run. Hopefully, something like that could be the cherry on top of a really nice season. you know, you look at the league table and Sunderland's form, and you do wonder if that sort of mythical European dream is a little bit beyond them. They're not going to get relegated. I'm still adamant on that. So could the FA Cup be something they really target? Nice, easy draw at home would be great. You know, maybe as if Arsenal and Man City could draw each other as well and knock each other out, or knock one out. That would be fantastic. But yeah, let's see what happens. But I was pleased by the attitude of the players, to be honest. And it was a potential banana skin. Oxford were well up for it. They were physical. They were a little bit annoyed at times at Sunderland. It did threaten to spill over, but I thought Sunderland kept their heads well. You know, they sort of controlled the game. Oxford did have a few moments. It was a bit of a classic cup tie in a way in that sense. But I think in terms of the Premier League, when everybody's fit and firing, they're going to have to improve against Brighton on Sunday if they want to come away with anything from that game at the Stadium of Light.
Yeah, I'm sort of increasingly of the feeling that now they are in a position where, you know, survival is maybe not mathematically, but, you know, it feels secure, doesn't it? You know, and I am sort of increasingly of the belief that the club are looking to throw as much heft behind this cup run as possible. I think that, I mean, obviously, you know, you never want to get ahead of yourself, especially where Sunderland are concerned. But when you are talking about being 2 games away from a potential return to Wembley, I just think that the optics of that, the narrative potential of that is so immense that I think that this is something that for the first time in a long time, the club are able and now willing to really sort of take seriously on a different sort of level. Again, like you say, you know, a performance that did what it needed to do. You know, you get yourself into the draw for the next round, you see what happens. Obviously, there are some ties in there that would be eminently more favourable to Sunderland than others. But as long as it's not Newcastle, I'll be happy. I think we leave that to one side for a while, hopefully. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting you bring up Tarby, because I was going to mention him actually. Obviously, when he came into the club in January, we were all a little bit unsure, weren't we, as to A, how fit he was, whether we'd see him anytime soon, and B, whether he was a signing that was expected to make an impact in the immediacy, or whether he was one that was, you know, being lined up for the future. The comments that Regis Labris has made himself would suggest that he wasn't overly sure, and it's almost as if he's been pleasantly surprised by Tarby and his level of performance in training. And like you sort of mentioned already, I mean, it was only a small cameo when he was playing a team who were currently in the relegation zone of the Championship, but he certainly looked as if he was up for it, didn't he? He looked as if he was willing to try and make good on his opportunity.
Yeah, I think that's key as well. You sometimes see a player come off the bench or even start a game and they don't quite seize that opportunity. And I thought he really, really did. He did just about as much as you can do, really, without sort of scoring or assisting to impress. I think what will be key with him, though, is that defensive work, because we know Labris talks about connection and he has to really trust the player, particularly from his wingers, really, in the Premier League, which is the right call. They're not really too bothered about what they do in attack. They would like to see them track back. That's why I like Traore. That's why I like Talby. That's why he played Lefay over on the left as well. He wants to see you sort of drop in. It's why he's like Romain Mundle, and he's probably stuck with him through a downturn in his form coming back from injury. And it's probably why Eliza Mayenda doesn't play on the right-hand side very often, and why he hasn't trusted Wilson Isidore to play on the left. So I think that will be key. Do you fit into the game model? Obviously, he looked very good going forward. There wasn't really much threat in behind him. So I think that'll be one to watch in terms of his development. But for me, he's definitely earned a spot on the bench ahead of the Brighton game. I'm excited by him. It feels like one of those Brucey bonus signings, doesn't it, Jace, where nobody really knew who he was. He was playing in the Israeli league. Nobody had heard of him. Nobody had seen him. If anybody had watched a live game of his or tries to tell you that they're lying, like that they are lying, because nobody had seen anything of him before. So if he does turn out to be good, I think what we picked him up for about 3.5 million, that would be a bit of a masterclass in scouting, to be honest, because he does look very, very sharp. And I just think with attacking players, Jace, we've said it before, but you can just tell sometimes when they get the ball, can't you? It can't really be measured in statistics and metrics. They get the ball at the feet and you just get a sense that something could happen. And I really felt that against Oxford. Again, the two main challenges will be defensively and consistency as well. Labris talks about it a lot, but you don't want this just to be a sort of 10-minute flash in the pan. Can you do it over the 90 minutes? All of that sort of stuff. So I'm sure we'll find out very soon. But all of a sudden, with players coming back from injury as well, Sunderland have, good options on the wing, I would suggest.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth noting that he predominantly likes to operate on the right wing. And how many times have we spoken on this podcast about, you know, Sunderland potentially not having the options in that area of the pitch that they do on the opposite flank, you know. So if he can come in, if he can, you know, impress wherever he might get his opportunities, then there's an opening, there's an opportunity for the lad, you know, and the risk is nothing if not meritocratic. So yeah, I think really impressive, really promising start to his Sunderland career, obviously, however brief it might have been. One last point to make, and we'll sort of wrap it up after that, but the great penalty debate continues. Habib Diarra stepped up from 12 yards and buried it. Obviously, the first penalty that Sunderland have had since Enzo Lefebvre's now sort of infamous Panenka against Brentford. I mean, interesting this one, isn't it, James? Because is this a case of Lebris handing over responsibility, or is it a case of Sunderland just having more than one penalty taker? Because back in the first Brentford game of the season at the Stadium of Light, we spoke to Enzo Lefebvre, and he actually said, well, you know, don't be surprised if I don't take the next one, because Habib Diarra is not bad. Obviously, Habib Diarra then goes and gets himself injured for however many months and goes to AFCON. And, you know, there's every chance that this was always going to be the plan, and Sunderland just haven't had a chance to let Diarra take one since.
Well, it was interesting. I was reading Lebris's comments after the game by our very own Phil Smith over on the website, but the gist of it is that Lebris is happy to let the players sort of sort it out on the pitch and let them rotate or sort it out between themselves. So it is interesting. I've always been of the opinion that you have your penalty taker and go from there, but this seems to be, dare I say, a little bit more of a modern way about it. I guess if you don't have those clear instructions from the bench, then you do have the potential for perhaps a little bit of to and fro and argumentation here and there, which I don't particularly like. Wilson Isidore, bless him, looked gutted that he wasn't allowed the chance to take it. You can't argue with Diarra's penalty because it was very good. Obviously, Isidore needs a goal and he missed his last two against Burnley. But yeah, I mean, I guess you could flip it and say it's good not to rely on one person. We know Enzo Lefebvre can take a penalty because he scored his next one after the Panenka, albeit in a shootout against Everton, emphatically. We've seen him score penalties before. That was a silly moment and a rush of blood to the head, wasn't it? I don't think he's going to be doing that anytime soon. And if he does and scores it at a big game, then more power to him. But it's great if you've got Habib Diarra who can step up and take them as well. I bet you Granit Xhaka can probably take a fairly good penalty. Obviously, Luke O'Nien kicks around the club still. So if he was ever required, and I guess in an in-game situation, that would keep the goalkeeper guessing a little bit. I know they'll have instructions and stuff, but if you're not really sure who's stepping up to take it and whatnot, and you've sort of prepared in your mind for one thing, that degree of uncertainty might help Sunderland a little bit. But yeah, I've no issue with Diarra or Lefebvre stepping up because and it sort of speaks to the way Sunderland's been ran over the past sort of 5 years. That it's the attacking midfielders and not the strikers who are turning the ball home.
One last nod to Kristjaan Speakman. Yeah. No, I've got no bother with anyone taking it as long as it goes in the back of the net, to be perfectly honest with you, pal.
Yeah, absolutely agree.
Right, let's wrap it up there. Then that's all we've got time for on this week's show. Join us again next week when we'll be discussing all of the latest Sunderland news and developments. In the meantime, you can follow all the latest Black Cats news on the Sunderland Echo. You can give us a follow on social media as well. Thanks to James. Thanks to you for listening, and we'll see you next time.